In today's Rank 'Em All video, we're going to take on the legendary Canadian speed metal band Exciter. Exciter was formed in the late 70s by John Ricci, Allan and Dan Beehler, and the Exciter album debuted back in 1983, and back then they were probably the fastest metal band on earth, at least until Metallica and Slayer put out their first records. And Exciter has stayed true to their formula, even during the mid to late 90s, so they deserve some cred for that. But before we get into the ranking of their albums, make sure that you guys pound that like button and subscribe if you aren't already subbed up, because now it's time to rank all full-length albums from Exciter. The worst Exciter album is, in my opinion, their latest record Death Machine from 2010, which is a bit harsh to say since I think that Exciter's discography is very solid and without any real missteps. Exciter was fronted by Kenny Metalmouth Winter during this period, and he also appeared on 2008's Thrash Speed Burn, and I think that his vocals fits like a glove. He surely can scream, and at times he sounds a bit like Udo Dirkschneider. But guitarist John Ricci was of course the band's main man, and he has kept the band alive through various lineups ever since the band reformed back in '96. Death Machine is a rather repetitive or perhaps formulaic album, depending on how you see things. And it's not necessarily a bad album even if I ranked it as Exciter's worst. It's just that the band has done it before and with more finesse. So, next. In 9th place we have Thrash Speed Burn from 2008. And when this album came out, it was 8 years since they last put out a record with original material. They did release the New Testament album in 2004, which was just new recordings of their old songs. On Thrash Speed Burn we're presented with a new vocalist in Kenny Winters, who delivers in the old Exciter tradition, I would say. Maybe he's a bit more controlled in comparison to Jacques Belanger and Dan Beehler though. And some people prefer his more traditional way of singing than the over-the-top style of Dan Beehler, for example. But I have nothing against some crazy falsetto vocals, it just made them sound more unique in my opinion. Thrash Speed Burn is a good album without them reinventing the wheel in any way. It's just a solid release, so next. In 8th place we have Exciter's self-titled album that came out in 1988, and this album was also known as OTT, which is short for Over the Top. And this was the band's 5th studio album, and for the first time ever, the band was no longer a trio due to them bringing in vocalist Rob Malnati into the lineup. But their singing drummer Dan Beehler couldn't resist throwing in some screams here and there. And their vocal styles are very similar, so it's kinda hard to tell who's singing what here. And even though Exciter were the kings of speed metal, this album definitely lacks some speed. And saying that the band aimed for a more commercial sound is to overstep the line a bit, but this album definitely has a friendlier tone to it, even if the vocals are still pretty extreme. You could see a shift in the band's direction on Unveiling the Wicked, and on their self-titled album, the band moved further away from the sound of their first 3 records. But on the other hand, we're still talking about Exciter here, so this is no Black Album or anything like it. The intro track Scream Bloody Murder is great though, but after that it all kinda fizzles out into some sort of generic 80s metal. So, next. In 7th place we have Blood of Tyrants from the year 2000, and I must say that I love 90s Exciter and beyond. Back then, most other metal bands had wimped out, but the reborn Exciter, with the at the time stable lineup of John Ricci, the Caron brothers Mark and Rick, and Jacques Belanger, did an amazing job on the Dark Command from '97, and then here on its follow-up Blood of Tyrants. Jacques Belanger is an underrated vocalist, and at times he reminds me a bit of Painkiller era Rob Halford. The vocals are more extreme here than on Thrash Speed Burn and Death Machine, for example. There are tons of falsetto screams with the usual metal clichés here, and there might be so much clichés here that this album can easily be seen as a caricature, but I have nothing against metal with some extra metal on top. The force of the molten mask fears the charge of metal crusaders. Next. In 6th place we have Unveiling the Wicked from 1986, and this album together with their self-titled album from 1988 were the two only Exciter albums to not feature guitarist and original member John Ricci, and this departure changed the band's sound to some degree. The powerful and pounding speed metal sound of their first 3 records was definitely altered here, because this album has more of a heavy metal vibe to it, and the vocals here are so over the top. It's one of the most extreme vocal performances that I've ever heard on a rather traditional sounding record. Dan Beehler screams, and then he screams some more. And the choruses are repetitive, but they are also very infectious, like in the songs Break Down the Walls, Die in the Night, I Hate School Rules, and Living Evil. And I used to love this record, and I still get nostalgic over it, but over the years I felt more and more that this album is a bit on the shallow side. There is a lot of screams, but not enough of that violence and force, if you know what I mean. And yeah, Brian McPhee was the band's new guitarist that replaced John Ricci, and he does a solid job on the record, there's no denying that. But his playing style is also a bit different, so it tweaked the band's sound, and unfortunately not for the better, so next. In 5th place we have Kill After Kill from 92, and this album came out around the same time that metal was dying. But Exciter didn't care about that, instead they put out their most fierce record in many years. And on this album guitarist John Ricci had rejoined the band, which I think you can hear in the intensity of this record. But it isn't a full reunion since bassist Allan Johnson had departed from the band. And this record was unexpected but also welcomed since the band had tried to clean up their sound over the last 2 records. But on Kill After Kill, Exciter tried to be themselves instead. But it is of course a very different thing to put out a record like this in 1992 in comparison to 1983. The production here is noisy, and it's probably the worst produced Exciter record now when I think of it. But I still hold this as an underrated record. And a lot of fans had probably fallen off by now and lost interest in the band due to the constant lineup changes and the drop of the quality of their outputs, so a lot of people didn't care for Exciter around this time. But I think that Exciter did the right thing and just kept being themselves, even if the general music listener became more interested in grunge around this time. And this album has hardly any views at all on Spotify, for example, which is kinda sad because this is a solid album. I wouldn't call it a masterpiece or anything, but it was a step in the right direction. And a funny fact here is that the band's current guitarist Dekay, who also works for the popular YouTube channel BangerTV, was born some time before the release of this record, so next. In 4th place we have The Dark Command from 1997. And this is a remarkable album for being released in 97. And I heard this album a year or 3 after it came out, and it was like, wow, are there still bands in this modern age that play metal like this? Some sort of speed and thrash metal hybrid with falsetto vocals and all. It was certainly an eye-opener, and Exciter was actually one of the few bands that put out something decent in the mid to late 90s. For me, this was the album of the year back in 97 when it came out. I mean, Burn at the Stake, Aggressor, Ritual Death and Screams from the Gallows. There are so many cool tracks on The Dark Command. This was also the first post-Dan Beehler record, but Exciter found a great vocalist in Jacques Belanger. And even if the whole lineup was new, besides John Ricci, this album helped re-establish real metal to some degree. Even if it was mainly the underground metal fans that took notice. So, next. In 3rd place we have Long Live the Loud from 1985, and this was the last Exciter album to feature the original trio of Dan Beehler, John Ricci and Allan Johnson. So in some sense this was the end of an era. Well, you could count the Feel the Knife EP to this era as well, which was for later repressings included as bonus tracks for this album. And these 3 original Exciter albums are the epitome of speed metal for me, They took this Venom or Motorhead sound and tweaked it a bit and put some rather insane shrieking vocals on top of that. And speaking of the vocals, Dan Beehler screams even more on this record than on the previous two. And there are several great songs here, like the title track Long Live the Loud and I Am the Beast. And I also like the cover art for this album, good stuff. Next. In second place, The Violence and Force from 1984, and I absolutely love this album. It's certainly one of the best speed metal albums of all time. And there are so many great songs here that I could mention all of them. The song Pounding Metal has this very infectious and pounding riff. I also love the title track Violence and Force, Scream in the Night and Saxons of the Fire. This album was produced by the Rods drummer Carl Kennedy, who also produced Anthrax Fistful of Metal, and Violence and Force is in a similar style, I would say. Black Knight, Metal Fight, tear it apart as we pound. Next. And the number one Exciter album is in my opinion Heavy Metal Maniac from 1983. And this was such a groundbreaking record when it was released back in January of 1983, before Metallica and Slayer had their first records out. So for a couple of months this was more or less the fastest and most intense metal album in the world. This was originally a demo, but it was soon pressed on vinyl and released as an album through Shrapnel Records. But you shouldn't worry too much about the low budget production here, because the music itself is so strong and pummeling that it really don't matter, because this is the essence of metal in my opinion. And Exciter were often compared to Anvil, but I think that this is a step up on the ladder if we compare this to Anvil's Forged in Fire that came out the same year. And Voivod and Razor hadn't even debuted yet, but this album is not only for the history books, it's also up there amongst the best speed metal albums of all time. I mean, tracks like Stand Up and Fight, Heavy Metal Maniac, Under Attack and Cry of the Banshee are songs with a new level of intensity and power that was up until this point unheard of. This is so classic that you can hardly even call yourself a metal fan if you aren't familiar with the first two Exciter albums. Because if you're not, then you haven't witnessed the true essence of metal. So let's have a look at my full Exciter rank. And I think that the first three Exciter albums, where the original trio was still intact, was not only the most influential era of the band, but also the best. But I also love the Jacques Belanger era with the Dark Command and Blood of Tyrants. Exciter was always a band that stayed with their original formula to some degree. Sure, they expanded a bit on their sound in different directions, but they never really ventured outside the speed metal realm. And Exciter is without a doubt metal legends, even though they might not be a household name like a lot of their peers. And having a drummer doing all the singing is still quite unique within the metal community. But now I wanna hear your opinions. Which album is your favorite Exciter album? And if you're familiar with their full discography, feel free to rank it down below. And if you enjoyed the video, then don't forget to pound that like button and subscribe so that this video can be recommended to those who need some Exciter in their life. And if you like my work, then it would be awesome if you would like to contribute by either becoming a Patreon like these fine gents, or by grabbing yourself a shirt at the Ruthless Metal store. Because I pour my soul into these videos, so your support is definitely appreciated. And let me know whose discography I should take on in the next episode of Rank 'Em All. And that's all for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye bye.